The crack of a sniper's rifle is a sound that doesn't just echo across a battlefield. It carves a permanent scar in the memory of every man who hears it. On a rain-slicked, muddy stretch of French countryside, somewhere east of the blood-soaked sands of Omaha Beach, that single, sharp report was the only warning Private First Class Leo Connolly received. One moment, his scouting partner, a kid from Ohio named Miller with a crooked smile and a nervous habit of humming Bing Crosby tunes, was there. The next, he was a heavy, silent weight in the mud, the light gone from his eyes before he even hit the ground. This wasn't the grand, sweeping charge of the newsreels. This was the intimate, filthy reality of war, a personal, violent theft of life that left Leo alone, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The German patrol was close, their guttural shouts cutting through the dense morning fog that clung to the hedgerows like a shroud. He was cut off. His platoon, his lifeline, was miles away, on the other side of a suddenly very active and very hostile German front. And in the blood-stained map case strapped to Miller's chest, a case Leo now pried from his friend's stiffening fingers, was something that couldn't fall into enemy hands. It was a sheaf of papers, hastily drawn but terrifyingly precise, detailing the entire German defensive network for this sector. Machine gun nests, artillery positions, fuel depots, and the crown jewel, the suspected location of a mobile panzer division being repositioned for a devastating counterattack. This was more than just a map. It was a prophecy of annihilation for thousands of American boys pouring onto the continent. And Leo Connolly, a radio operator from a small town in Pennsylvania who had never felt more insignificant, was now the only soul on this God-forsaken piece of earth who knew it. Could he simply survive the next 10 minutes, let alone get this information back? The weight of the knowledge was a physical pressure, a cold stone in his gut. He had no radio, no food, and a canteen with a single, precious mouthful of water left. The enemy was everywhere, a tightening noose of field gray and the sharp, predatory scent of coal tar soap. His only choice was to move, to vanish into the mist-shrouded bocage, to become a ghost. But how far could one man get, a lone American soldier walking through the heart of the German war machine? The first step was the hardest, pulling his boots from the sucking mud, leaving Miller behind, a silent sentinel in a field of green. He moved not as a soldier, but as a predator, every scent screaming, every shadow a potential threat. The rustle of a leaf was a grenade pin dropping. The call of a distant bird was a signal between centuries. He was a mile in, maybe two, when he heard the dogs. The baying was deep, primal, a sound that bypassed the brain and spoke directly to the most ancient parts of the human spirit, the parts that knew what it was to be hunted. They were on his trail, and they were getting closer. The baying of the hounds was a physical force, a wave of sound that pushed him forward, driving him through thorny thickets that tore at his uniform and ripped shallow, stinging lines across his skin. He didn't feel the pain. Adrenaline was a fire in his veins, burning away everything but the primal imperative to run. His mind, however, raced faster than his feet. They knew he was here. They knew he had something. The map case felt like it was glowing, a beacon announcing his treachery to every German within 5 miles. He splashed through a shallow, ice-cold creek, the water numbing his ankles, a desperate, age-old trick to break his scent. He scrambled up the far bank, mud caking his hands and knees, and pressed himself against the gnarled trunk of an ancient oak, his chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged, tearing gasps that he fought to silence. He could hear them on the other side of the water, the handlers shouting commands, the dogs frustrated, snuffling at the bank. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought it had worked. Then the barking started again, more frenzied than before. They had found the crossing point. They were coming. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. This was it. He was going to be run down like an animal in these anonymous French woods. The intelligence lost, Miller's death rendered meaningless. His hand went to the cold, hard steel of his M1 Garand. But what was one rifle against a squad of seasoned hunters with automatic weapons? His eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape that didn't exist. And then he saw it. Not an escape, but a chance. A fissure in the earth, barely visible behind a curtain of ivy and brambles. The entrance to what looked like an old root cellar or a forgotten animal den. It was a tight squeeze, a mouth of darkness. Without a second thought, he plunged into it, wriggling backwards, pulling the foliage back into place behind him, just as the first German shepherd burst from the tree line, its powerful body a coiled spring of muscle and intent. He held his breath, pressing himself into the cool, damp earth of the tiny space. The world outside was a cacophony of snarling dogs, booted feet, and guttural German. A soldier's legs passed within inches of his hiding place. He could smell the leather of their boots, the faint, acrid scent of tobacco. He closed his eyes, praying to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The voices began to move away, the baying of the hounds growing fainter, redirected by a frustrated handler. They were moving on. He had survived the first hunt. But as the immediate terror receded, a new, more profound dread settled in its place. He was buried alive in French soil, utterly alone. The weight of his mission pressed down on him in the absolute blackness. He was 100 miles from the nearest American line. 100 miles of enemy territory, of patrols, of checkpoints, of civilians who might betray him for a crust of bread. He had no plan, no supplies, and the certainty that the Germans now knew an American with vital intelligence was loose behind their lines. Unclipping his canteen, he allowed himself one single precious sip of water, the liquid a fleeting blessing in his parched throat. The journey hadn't even begun, and he was already at the brink. How does a man walk 100 miles when every step could be his last? The answer, he realized with a grim, terrifying clarity, was one step at a time. He would have to move only at night, navigate by the stars, live off the land, and trust no one. Waiting until full dark, he finally emerged from the earth like a creature of the night, coated in dirt and shivering with a cold that came from deep within his soul. The landscape had transformed under the cloak of darkness, familiar landmarks now sinister silhouettes. He oriented himself by the faint glow of the North Star, a lonely, constant friend in a hostile sky, and began to walk, each footfall a silent prayer. He had traveled less than 5 miles when he saw the faint, golden glow of a farmhouse window in the distance, a tiny island of warmth in a sea of black. It was a risk, a terrible risk, but his stomach clenched with a hunger that was becoming a dull, constant ache, and his canteen was empty. Was it a sanctuary or a trap? There was only one way to find out, and as he crept towards the sliver of light, he could feel the eyes of the entire German army watching him from the shadows.
The farmhouse stood silent and seemingly abandoned, its outlines stark against the star-dusted sky. But that single, downstairs window glowed with the soft, warm light of an oil lamp, a siren's call in the overwhelming darkness. For nearly an hour, Leo lay in a frozen furrow at the edge of the property, watching, waiting. No movement, no sound but the whisper of the wind through the wheat fields. His thirst was a raging fire now, his hunger a sharp, twisting knot. The decision to approach felt less like a choice and more like a biological imperative. He moved with agonizing slowness, a shadow flitting from the cover of a rusted plow to the deeper blackness beside a stone well. The back door was slightly ajar, creaking on a rusty hinge with a sound that seemed to scream his presence to the world. He slipped inside, the warmth of the interior hitting him like a physical blow, the scent of wood smoke and stew causing his stomach to roar in protest. The kitchen was small, cluttered, and empty. A pot sat on a cold iron stove. His eyes scanned the room, falling on a pitcher of water and a half loaf of dark, heavy bread on the rough-hewn table. It was a feast. He was about to lunge for it when a floorboard creaked behind him. He spun around, his rifle coming up, his finger tightening on the trigger. In the doorway stood an old man, so thin he seemed a skeleton draped in worn wool, his face a web of deep lines, his eyes wide with a fear that mirrored Leo's own. In his gnarled hands he held not a weapon, but a crucifix. He was trembling. "Américain?" the old man whispered, the word barely audible. Leo could only nod, his own voice trapped in his throat. The old man's eyes darted to the window, then back to Leo. He gestured frantically for him to lower the rifle. He moved to the table, broke the bread in two, and shoved the larger piece into Leo's hands along with the pitcher. "Vite, quickly," he hissed. "Bosch, they come here, sometimes." Leo didn't need to understand the language to grasp the meaning. He drank the water in deep, desperate gulps, the liquid a miracle, and tore into the bread, the coarse texture the most wonderful thing he had ever tasted. The old man watched him, his fear slowly being replaced by a grim, determined sorrow. He pointed a bony finger east. "Les lignes, là-bas, beaucoup de kilomètres," many kilometers. Then he made a sweeping motion with his hand and shook his head, a universal sign for danger for a great many soldiers. He was trying to warn him. The gratitude that flooded Leo was so profound it felt like weakness. He reached out, clasped the old man's shoulder for a brief second, a silent thank you that transcended words. He had to go, now. But as he turned back to the door, a new sound froze the blood in his veins. Not the baying of hounds, but the low, grumbling growl of a military vehicle engine, growing steadily louder. Headlights sliced through the darkness outside, painting the kitchen walls with moving bars of light. The old man's face went ashen. He shoved Leo hard towards a small pantry closet filled with sacks of grain. "Cache-toi," he whispered urgently. "Hide." Leo crammed himself into the tight space, pulling the door shut until only a hairline crack remained, his view a sliver of the kitchen. The vehicle, a German Kugelwagen, screeched to a halt outside. Doors slammed, boots crunched on gravel. The front door, not the back, swung open with a force that shook the small house. 2 German soldiers, not frontline troops, but older, heavier Feldgendarmerie, military police, strode in, their arrogance filling the room. The leader, a sergeant with a bulbous, red-veined nose, began barking questions at the old man in rapid, contemptuous French. The old man just shook his head, playing the part of a simple, terrified peasant. The sergeant sneered, and his eyes began to roam the room, landing on the table, on the second piece of bread, on the pitcher of water, now noticeably depleted. Leo's heart stopped. The sergeant's gaze narrowed. He knew. Someone else had been here, very recently. His hand went to the pistol at his hip as he took a step towards the pantry door.
In the suffocating darkness of the pantry, Leo could smell the dust from the grain sacks, the sour tang of his own fear, and the faint, metallic oil from the bolt of his M1 Garand. Through the crack in the door, he watched the German sergeant's eyes, hard and suspicious, lock onto the pantry. The man's hand rested on the butt of his Luger. Every instinct screamed at Leo to burst out, to fire first, to go down fighting. But that would mean the death of the old man and the almost certain discovery of the map case. The intelligence would die with him. He was trapped, a rat in a cage, his fate balanced on the razor's edge of a German non-commissioner's curiosity. The sergeant took one step, then another, his shadow falling across the sliver of light. The old man, seeing the direction of his gaze, began to cough violently, a racking, pathetic sound, doubling over and stumbling between the sergeant and the pantry door. It was a desperate, brilliant act. The sergeant paused, annoyed, his attention momentarily diverted. He barked something at the old man, who gestured weakly to his own chest, feigning a fit of consumptive illness. The other soldier, a younger, weasel-faced private, chuckled and said something that made the sergeant scowl. For a long, agonizing moment, the decision hung in the balance. Then, with a final, disgusted look around the room, the sergeant turned. "Raus!" he grunted to his companion. "Out!" They stomped back through the house, the front door slamming shut behind them. Leo didn't move. He couldn't. He listened to the engine turn over, the grind of gears, the sound of the vehicle fading slowly down the road. Only then did he allow himself to breathe, his body trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline. The old man opened the pantry door, his face still pale with terror. He didn't speak, just pointed firmly towards the back door and then towards the deep, dark woods behind his property. The message was clear: go and do not come back. Leo nodded his thanks, a debt he could never repay, and slipped back out into the night. The encounter had shaken him to his core. It wasn't just the patrols and the dogs he had to fear. It was the simple, mundane interactions of occupied life. A piece of bread, a pitcher of water, these could betray him. He moved with renewed paranoia, his senses so heightened he could hear the scuttling of a field mouse 10 yards away. The next 2 nights were a grueling test of endurance. He navigated by the stars, avoiding all roads, moving cross-country through fields and forests. He drank from muddy streams, the water giving him cramps that doubled him over in pain. He ate handfuls of sour, unripe berries that tore at his stomach. Sleep was a furtive, dangerous luxury, snatched in thickets for a few precious minutes at a time. He was beginning to fade, his body consuming itself, his mind growing foggy. On the 3rd night, he stumbled upon a small, secluded orchard. The apples were small and hard, but they were food. As he greedily stuffed them into his pockets, a sound froze him mid-reach. It wasn't German. It was the low, frantic murmur of voices, speaking in French. Peering through the gnarled branches of an apple tree, he saw a sight that made his blood run cold. A group of 3 men, dressed in rough civilian clothes, were digging a shallow, hurried grave. And beside them, lying in the grass, were 2 bodies clad in the unmistakable field gray of the Wehrmacht. This was no civilian work party. This was the French resistance. And he had just walked right into the middle of an execution. The scene in the moonlit orchard was frozen, a grim tableau of the shadow war that raged behind the lines. The Frenchman, hearing the rustle of Leo's movement, reacted with the swift, lethal grace of hunted men. In an instant, shovels were dropped, and 3 ancient but deadly pistols were pointed directly at his chest. Leo, his hands instinctively shooting into the air, knew that a single wrong word, a single sudden move, would be his last. "Ne bouge pas," one of them, a tall, gaunt man with intense dark eyes, commanded. "Don't move." Leo, his mind racing, fought to find the few words of French he knew. "Américain," he choked out, the word dry and cracked. "Je suis Américain, soldat." The men didn't lower their weapons. Their faces were hard, suspicious. The tall man took a step forward, his eyes scanning Leo's torn, mud-caked uniform. "Papier," he demanded. "Identification." Leo, slowly, carefully, gestured to his chest, to the map case still secured under his jacket. "Non, important, pour mon commandant, très important." He was fumbling, the language barrier a wall he couldn't scale. The tall man gestured with his pistol for Leo to open the case. This was the moment of truth. To show them the maps was an immense risk, a breach of every security protocol he'd ever been taught. But these men were his only potential allies in 100-mile sea of enemies. With trembling fingers, he unbuttoned his jacket and withdrew the oilskin case. He unfolded the top map, the one showing the German artillery positions. In the pale moonlight, the intricate hand-drawn symbols were stark and menacing. The Frenchmen crowded around, their harsh breaths pluming in the cold air. The tall one, whose name he would learn was Luc, traced a finger over one of the artillery symbols, his face a mask of grim understanding. He looked from the map to Leo, his eyes taking in the haggard face, the desperate determination. The suspicion in his gaze did not vanish, but it was joined by a flicker of respect. He lowered his pistol. The others followed suit. "D'accord," Luc said softly. "Okay." They quickly finished their grim work, covering the German soldiers, and then motioned for Leo to follow. They moved like ghosts through the night, leading him to a hidden cellar beneath a bombed-out barn a few miles away. It was a sparse, damp space, but it was a sanctuary. They gave him real food, a piece of strong cheese and some coarse sausage, and a bottle of rough red wine that tasted like heaven. Using a combination of broken English, fractured French, and hand gestures, Leo conveyed his mission, to get to the American lines to the west, to deliver the maps. Luc shook his head, his expression grave. "Impossibly. The roads, the bridges, all are guarded. The Boche, they are everywhere, like flies on meat." He explained that the Germans, alerted to a possible intelligence leak, had thrown up a series of new checkpoints and patrols. The direct route was a suicide run. But then Luc leaned forward, his eyes glinting in the candlelight. "There is another way, a longer way, through the marshes, les marais. The Germans, they avoid it. They say it is haunted, that men disappear." He looked at Leo, gauging his mettle. "It is a terrible place, but it is your only chance." The choice was a nightmare. The direct route offered a slim, almost non-existent chance of a quick breakthrough. The Marsh offered a longer, more grueling journey through a landscape that was its own kind of enemy, a sucking, treacherous quagmire that could drown a man as easily a bullet. But it was a path the Germans might not be watching. As the first hints of dawn tinted the horizon, Luke provided him with a stolen German poncho, a little more food, and rough-drawn directions into the heart of the wetlands. "Bonne chance, Américain," Luke said, clasping his arm. "Good luck." Leo slipped out of the barn and turned not west, but south, towards the vast, mist-shrouded expanse of the Marais. He was trading one hell for another, leaving the solid ground behind for a world of water, mud, and shifting illusions. The first step into the reeking, stagnant water was like stepping into a cold, living grave. And as the fog closed around him, swallowing him whole, he wondered if he had just chosen a slower, more agonizing death, a solitary end in a forgotten swamp where no one would ever find his body or the secret he carried.
The world dissolved into a monochrome nightmare of gray and brown. The Marais was not land, nor was it water. It was a soupy, malevolent purgatory that clung to his legs with every step, trying to pull him down into its cold, dark heart. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the incessant, maddening drone of mosquitoes that clouded around his face, finding every inch of exposed skin. Visibility was rarely more than 20 feet, the fog a permanent, dripping shroud that distorted sound and turned skeletal trees into the shapes of lurking men. He moved with a slow, exhausting rhythm. Pull one boot from the sucking muck with a loud, gasping slurp, plant it forward, feel for solid ground, then repeat with the other. It was a Sisyphean torture, each step a victory won against the earth itself. His progress was measured not in miles, but in yards. The rough map Luke had given him was next to useless in this featureless void. Navigation was by instinct alone, a desperate hope that he was still moving in a generally westerly direction. Time lost all meaning. There was only the fog, the mud, the insects, and the crushing, soul-deep fatigue. He slept fitfully, curled on the rare, semi-dry hummock he could find, the poncho pulled over his head, waking every few minutes to the sound of something slithering through the water nearby. On the second day, the sky opened up, a cold, relentless rain that turned the marsh into a churning, bottomless soup. The water level rose, covering what few landmarks there were. He was wading now, chest deep in places, the cold seeping into his bones until his teeth chattered uncontrollably. The map case held above his head became his sole focus, the one dry, sacred object in this world of wet misery. He began to hallucinate from exhaustion and hunger. He saw Miller standing on a distant bank, waving him forward. He heard his mother's voice calling him home. The line between reality and nightmare blurred into a continuous, waking dream of suffering. It was on the third day that he found the body. It was a German soldier, caught in a tangle of submerged roots, his uniform bleached and tattered, his face a waxy, bloated mask. He had been here for some time. The sight should have horrified him, but in his depleted state, it only registered as a grim landmark, a confirmation that others had tried and failed to conquer this place. He gave the corpse a wide berth, the water swirling where he passed. That night, as he tried to rest on a small island of reeds, he heard a new sound. It was a low, rhythmic chugging, the sound of a shallow draft boat. And voices, German voices. They were close, dangerously close, cutting through the fog like ghosts. A patrol boat. They were searching the marshes. He slid silently off his perch and submerged himself completely in the icy, foul water, holding onto the reeds, with only his nose and eyes above the surface. The boat materialized out of the mist, a gray, sinister shape with a single searchlight beam cutting a feeble path through the gloom. 2 soldiers were aboard, one steering, the other sweeping the shoreline with the light. The beam passed over the water where he was hiding, illuminating the reeds just feet from his face. He held his breath, his body screaming for air. The boat chugged past, the sound of its engine and the soldiers' bored conversation fading slowly away. He waited until the silence was absolute before pulling himself, shivering violently, back onto the hummock. He had escaped detection, but the encounter had cost him what little warmth and energy he had left. He was at his breaking point, his body a hollow shell, his mind fraying at the edges. The marsh was trying to kill him, not with violence, but with indifference, by slowly eroding his will to live. As a pale, sickly dawn began to filter through the fog, he forced himself to his feet. One more step, then another. He had lost all track of how long he had been in this hell. But as he pushed through a final, dense wall of cattails, the ground beneath his feet began to feel different, firmer. The water receded to his knees, then his ankles. The fog thinned, and then, suddenly, he was out. He stood on the solid, blessed bank of a slow-moving river, the other side of the Marais. He had crossed it. He collapsed onto the grass, weeping with a relief so profound it was a physical pain. But his celebration was short-lived. As his senses returned, a new sound reached his ears, a sound that was as familiar as it was terrifying. It was the distant, methodical thunder of artillery. The front. He was getting closer. But between him and that thunder lay the river, wide, deep, and swift. And on the far bank, partially concealed by trees, he could just make out the geometric, unnatural lines of a German fortification, a concrete pillbox watching the waterline with silent, murderous intent.
The river was a moat, and the pillbox on the far bank was the castle keep, its dark, narrow firing slit a blind eye staring directly at him. He was so close. The rumble of the big guns was a constant, grumbling promise of salvation, a sound that meant his people were just on the other side of that horizon. But this stretch of water, maybe 100 yards across, might as well have been the Atlantic Ocean. He was pinned. Swimming was impossible. The current was strong, and he'd be a slow, helpless target in the water for any machine gunner with a semblance of alertness. He spent the day hidden in a dense thicket of brambles, watching the far bank through a small gap in the foliage. The pillbox was active. Every few hours, a soldier would emerge to stretch his legs or smoke a cigarette. It was a two-man position, a fact he noted with a sniper's cold calculation. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of purple and orange, a plan began to form in his mind. It was a desperate, reckless plan, born of exhaustion and the absolute certainty that there was no other way. He would have to cross the river under the cover of darkness, but not by swimming. A few hundred yards downstream, he had spotted the remains of a bombed-out bridge, its stone piers still standing in the water, the skeletal iron framework twisted and broken. If he could navigate that wreckage, he might be able to pick his way across, using the debris as cover. It was a long shot, a gamble with the highest stakes imaginable. Waiting for full dark was an agony. The night was clear, the moon a bright, cold coin that illuminated the landscape almost too well. He moved like a stalking animal, keeping to the shadows, his body low to the ground. The wreckage of the bridge was a stark, jagged silhouette against the starry sky. The river swirled angrily around the broken stones and bent steel. He began his traverse, moving from one slippery, algae-covered stone to another, his hands gripping cold, rusted iron beams. The sound of the water masked his movements, but every shift of his weight, every scrape of his boot against metal, sounded to him like a cannon shot. He was halfway across when he heard it. A voice from the far bank, a German voice, sharp and questioning. A sentry patrolling the bridgehead had heard something. A flashlight beam stabbed through the darkness, sweeping over the water, playing across the twisted girders. Leo froze, pressing himself against a massive concrete pylon, his body merging with the shadow. He held his breath. The beam passed over his head, then came back, slower this time. The sentry was suspicious. He was calling out to someone, his voice growing closer. Leo could hear the man's boots on the gravel of the bank. He was coming to investigate. Trapped on the pylon, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, Leo did the only thing he could. He let go. He slipped silently into the icy, fast-moving current, allowing it to pull him downstream, away from the bridge. He swam underwater for as long as his burning lungs would allow, then surfaced with a gasp, gulping air. He was past the pillbox, its menacing form now on the bank behind him. But he was in the middle of the river, being swept swiftly away, the water numbing his limbs. He fought to angle himself towards the far shore, kicking with the last of his strength. His boots and waterlogged clothes were anchors, dragging him down. The current was winning, pulling him towards the center of the channel, towards a darker, more violent roar further downstream. A waterfall? Rapids? He didn't know, and he didn't want to find out. With a final Herculean effort, he kicked and thrashed, his muscles screaming in protest. His hand brushed against a submerged branch, then caught it. He held on, pulling himself, hand over hand, through the rushing water until his knees scraped against gravel. He crawled onto the bank, vomiting river water, his body convulsing with cold and exhaustion. He was across. He was on the western side of the river. But as he lay there, spent and shivering, he realized the flashlight beam from the bridge was still searching. And now it was joined by another, and the sound of barking. They had found his trail again. He was on the right side of the river, but he was far from safe. The hunt was back on, and he had delivered himself right into their backyard. The baying of the dogs was a nightmare reborn, a sound that tore at the very fabric of his sanity. He was on his feet, staggering, his body a dead weight fueled solely by terror. The far bank was no longer a sanctuary, it was a killing field. He had escaped the river only to find himself in a narrow strip of land between the water and a dense, dark forest. The Germans would be crossing the bridge now, deploying a full search party. He was leaving a trail a blind man could follow, a dripping, shivering path of water and mud. His only hope was the forest. He plunged into the tree line, the darkness beneath the canopy so absolute it was like being swallowed. He ran, not with direction, but with the blind, panicked instinct of a flushed rabbit. Branches whipped his face, roots snagged his feet, sending him sprawling more than once. Each time he clawed his way back up, the map case a hard, insistent reminder against his ribs. Keep going, always keep going. The sounds of pursuit grew louder behind him, shouts, the crack of a branch, the dogs, always the dogs. He was leaving a scent trail they would never lose. He could feel his strength ebbing, his lungs burning, his legs turning to lead. He wasn't going to make it. He was going to be run down in these woods, so close to his goal. Despair, a black and final tide, began to rise within him. And then, a miracle. The forest ended as abruptly as it began, opening onto a scene of surreal, industrial devastation. He had stumbled into what was clearly a recent battlefield. The earth was churned into a lunar landscape of craters, some filled with stagnant, oily water. The skeletons of burnt-out trucks and a half-track littered the area. The husks of farm buildings stood blackened and roofless against the sky. It was a place of death and silence. And it was his only chance. He scrambled into the largest shell crater, sliding down the muddy side into a foot of foul, cold water. He pressed himself against the earth, trying to make himself small, to become just another piece of the ruin. The search party emerged from the tree line, fanning out. The dogs, confused by the cacophony of old scents, cordite, oil, blood, death, began to mill about, their baying turning to frustrated yips. The German sergeant was shouting, trying to regain control of the situation. Leo could hear them moving through the wreckage, their boots crunching on debris, their voices tense and angry. They were so close he could hear the squelch of their footsteps in the mud. A soldier peered over the rim of his crater, his silhouette stark against the night sky. Leo held his breath, his finger on the trigger of his Garand, prepared to take one last German with him. But the soldier, seeing nothing but a water-filled hole, moved on. The search continued for what felt like an hour, the Germans methodically combing through the shattered landscape. But the trail had gone cold. The dogs had lost it. Finally, with a series of sharp commands, the sergeant called his men back. The sounds of the patrol receded, fading back into the forest. Leo didn't move. He waited another full hour after the last sound had died away, his body trembling uncontrollably in the icy water. When he was certain they were gone, he crawled out of the crater, a creature of mud and filth. He was safe, for now. But the ordeal had cost him everything. His food was gone, lost in the river. His last reserves of strength were utterly depleted. He was shaking with a fever, his wounds from the thorns and his fall in the marsh inflamed and throbbing. He was a sick, starving man in the middle of a wasteland. The artillery thunder was louder now, a continuous rolling barrage that shook the ground beneath his feet. He was within 10, maybe 5 miles of the front. So close. But those last few miles were the most dangerous of all. A no-man's land of shifting fronts, trigger-happy sentries, and random violent death. He began to walk, his progress a slow, painful shamble. He was no longer a soldier on a mission. He was a dying man's last crawl towards the light. He moved from crater to crater, from wreck to wreck, using the devastation as his cover. The sky began to lighten in the east, a dirty gray smear announcing the dawn. In the growing half-light, he saw a sight that made his heart lurch. A small, shell-damaged church, its steeple tilting precariously, standing alone in a field. It was a place that might offer shelter, a final, desperate place to rest before attempting the last, impossible leg of his journey. He stumbled towards it, pushing open the heavy, splintered door. The interior was a wreck, pews shattered, stained glass windows blown in, leaving colorful shards littering the stone floor. But it was a roof. It was shelter. He collapsed in a shadowed corner behind the altar, his body giving out at last. He was succumbing to the fever, his mind slipping in and out of consciousness. He had come so far, endured so much. But as he lay there, drifting in a delirious haze, he heard a sound that cut through the fog of his illness. It was the sound of engines. Not the distant American engines he prayed for, but the distinctive high-pitched whine of German motorcycles. They were pulling up outside the church.
The sound of the motorcycle engines died, replaced by the rough, confident voices of German soldiers and the crunch of their boots on the broken glass outside the church door. They were coming in. This was it, the end of the road. After 100 miles, after the marshes, the river, the endless hunts, it would end here, in this desecrated house of God. A profound, weary resignation settled over Leo. He hadn't the strength to run, to fight. He was done. His hand fell away from his rifle. Let them come. But as the door began to creak open, a different instinct, a final, stubborn spark of the will that had carried him this far, flared to life. He wasn't dead yet. Scrambling on his hands and knees, he crawled behind the massive, ornately carved pulpit, squeezing into the narrow, dark space between its back and the cold stone wall of the apse. It was a pathetic hiding place, a child's spot, but it was all he had. The Germans entered the church, 3 of them, their voices echoing in the hollow space. They weren't a search party. They sounded relaxed, almost bored. A reconnaissance unit, perhaps, using the church as a temporary observation post. They spoke casually, laughing about something, their boots scuffing through the debris. One of them lit a cigarette, the match flaring briefly in the dim light. Leo held his breath, pressing himself deeper into the shadows. He could see their legs moving between the pews. They were fanning out, inspecting the ruin. One soldier walked slowly down the center aisle, his footsteps coming to a halt near the altar. Leo could see the man's dusty jackboots from beneath the bottom of the pulpit. They were less than 10 feet away. The soldier was silent for a moment. Then he grunted, and Leo heard the sound of a canteen being unscrewed. The German took a long drink, then sighed with satisfaction. The sound of the water was a fresh torment to Leo's parched throat. He watched, helpless, as a few drops fell from the canteen and spattered on the stone floor. The soldier then did something unexpected. He began to hum. It was a quiet, melancholy tune, a folk song perhaps. He walked away from the altar, his humming fading as he rejoined his comrades near the door. For the next hour, the Germans remained in the church, talking in low voices, occasionally scanning the landscape outside through a broken window. Leo stayed frozen in his hiding place, every muscle screaming in protest, his feverish body trembling. He fought to stay silent, to keep his breathing even. The slightest cough, the rustle of his clothing, would mean discovery. The wait was an eternity, a slow-burning fuse attached to his own mortality. Finally, he heard the sound he had been praying for. A sharp command. The soldiers gathered their gear, the motorcycle engines coughed to life once more, and then the sound receded into the distance. They were gone. He waited another 10 minutes, then 20, just to be sure. Then, and only then, did he allow himself to crawl out from his hiding place. His body was stiff, his mind foggy. He stumbled to the spot where the German soldier had stood, falling to his knees and licking the few precious drops of water from the stone floor like a wild animal. The act shamed him, but survival had stripped away all pretense of dignity. He had to move. The front was close. He could feel it. Staggering out of the church, he oriented himself by the sound of the guns, which were now a near constant thunder. He moved through a landscape utterly transformed by war. This was the leading edge of the front, a place where the earth had been gutted, trees reduced to splinters, and the air was thick with the smell of cordite and corruption. He passed the remains of an American Sherman tank, its turret blown clean off, the blackened interior a grim tomb. He saw other, more personal horrors that he forced himself not to see, not to process. He was in the belly of the beast. And then, through the smoke and haze, he saw them. Figures moving in a ditch about 300 yards away. Their helmets were round, their uniforms were a drab olive green. Americans. A wave of emotion so powerful it nearly buckled his knees washed over him. He wanted to shout, to run towards them, to weep with relief. But he stopped himself. He was on the wrong side of the line. To them, he was a lone, ragged figure emerging from enemy territory. He would look like a German trick, a ruse to draw fire and reveal their position. He had to be careful, very careful. He raised his hands high above his head, the white of his palms a universal signal of surrender. He began to walk slowly, deliberately towards the ditch. "Don't shoot," he screamed, his voice a raw, broken thing. "I'm an American! I'm an American!" A head popped up from the ditch, helmeted, a rifle aimed directly at his chest. "Halt! Stop right there!" a voice yelled back. Leo froze. He was 100 yards away. So close. "My name is Private First Class Leo Connolly, 2nd Battalion, 16th Infantry. I have vital intelligence for command," he shouted, his voice cracking. The soldier in the ditch hesitated. He turned and said something to someone else down the line. Another soldier rose, this one with a lieutenant's bar on his helmet. He peered through binoculars. The moment stretched, taut and deadly. Leo stood there, his arms in the air, completely exposed, praying that the lieutenant would see the desperation on his face, the tattered remains of an American uniform. The lieutenant lowered his binoculars. He shouted an order, and in that split second, Leo saw the machine gunner next to him shift his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger.
The world seemed to slow to a crawl. Leo saw the machine gunner's knuckle whiten, saw the lieutenant's mouth open to shout a countermanding order. It was a razor's edge, a decision that would be made in a fraction of a second, a decision that would end his life and render his entire journey meaningless. "Hold your fire," the lieutenant's voice finally cut through the tense silence, sharp and clear. "Hold your fire, goddammit!" The machine gunner relaxed his grip, but the barrel remained pointed in Leo's direction. The lieutenant, his face a mask of wary disbelief, gestured for Leo to approach. "Slowly, keep your hands where I can see them." Leo walked forward, his legs feeling like jelly, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. As it got closer, he could see the faces of the GIs in the ditch. Young, tired, filthy faces, their eyes wide with a mixture of suspicion and astonishment. He was a ghost, a specter from behind enemy lines, and he didn't look real. He stumbled the last few feet and collapsed at the edge of the ditch, his strength finally completely gone. Hands grabbed him, pulling him down into the relative safety of the earthwork. He lay on his back, gasping, looking up at the concerned, confused faces of his countrymen. "Medic," the lieutenant barked. He knelt beside Leo. "Who the hell are you, soldier?" Leo, with a trembling hand, pointed to his chest, to the map case. "The maps," he croaked. "Got to get them to command. German counterattack. Panzers." His words were slurred, his thoughts jumbled. The lieutenant's eyes widened. He carefully unstrapped the case and opened it. His face went pale as he scanned the top map. He was a junior officer, but he knew enough to understand the terrifying significance of what he was holding. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. He looked back at Leo, his expression now one of sheer awe. How did you get this?" Leo just shook his head, the story too long, too heavy to tell. A medic arrived, slapping a field dressing on the worst of his cuts, forcing him to drink from a canteen. The clean, cool water was a revelation. He was safe. He had done it. A jeep was summoned, and within minutes he was being rushed rearward, bouncing over the cratered landscape towards a battalion command post. The journey was a blur. He was processed with a speed that spoke to the importance of his cargo. He was debriefed by a stunned intelligence captain who listened, his jaw slack, as Leo gave a fragmented account of his journey. The death of Miller, the farmhouse, the resistance, the marsh, the river, the church. He was given hot food, the first real meal in over a week, but he could barely keep it down. His body was shutting down, the adrenaline that had sustained him for so long finally receding, leaving behind a wreck. He was placed in a cot in a medical tent, and he fell into a deep, dreamless sleep that felt like death. When he awoke, hours later, a colonel was standing at the foot of his cot. The man had a grim, serious face. "Son," the colonel said, his voice low and gravelly, "the information you brought back, it's confirmed a lot of our worst fears. That Panzer division you spotted? We've redirected 2 squadrons of fighter bombers onto their suspected location. You may have just saved a lot of lives. Maybe even turned the tide in this sector." He looked at Leo, and for a moment the stern military mask slipped, revealing a look of profound respect. "What you did? I've never heard of anything like it." Leo nodded weakly, the words not quite registering. He had done his duty. It was over. He was given a clean uniform and, after a day of rest, was assigned to a truck heading further back to a proper field hospital for evaluation. As the truck rumbled away from the front, away from the thunder of the guns, he looked out at the passing columns of fresh-faced American troops moving up to the line. Boys, just like Miller, just like he had been. They looked at him, a ragged, hollow-eyed soldier being driven away from the fight, with indifference or perhaps pity. They didn't know. They couldn't know. He had walked through hell to deliver a message, and he had delivered it. But as the truck carried him toward safety and a clean bed, a new, unsettling feeling began to creep into his soul. The mission was over, but the war was not. And a part of him, the part that had become a ghost, a predator, a survivor, knew that the 100 miles he had walked had changed him forever. He was safe in body, but his mind was still back there, in the mud and the mist and the darkness, forever walking behind enemy lines. The battle for survival was over. The battle to come home, truly home, was just beginning. And as the truck rounded a bend, the sound of a distant artillery shell screaming in found its mark, ducking his head instinctively, a reaction born of 100 miles of terror, a reminder that the war would always be with him, a ghost in the machine of his own mind.
The smell of antiseptic and bleach was a poor substitute for the scent of rain-soaked earth and cordite, but it was the smell of life, of order, of a world trying to mend what had been broken. The field hospital was a chaotic symphony of murmured pain, hurried footsteps, and the low, constant hum of generators. For Leo Connolly, lying on a crisp white cot, the relative silence was deafening. The thunder of artillery was now a distant, phantom rumble in his bones, a vibration his body had learned to expect and now missed with a perverse ache. They had cleaned him, stitched the worst of his wounds, and fed him something bland and nourishing. His body was beginning to understand the concept of safety, but his mind lagged far behind, still trapped in the relentless loop of the past 10 days. Every time a door swung shut with a bang, his heart would stutter. The shadow of a nurse moving past his bed was a German sentry. The rhythmic beeping of a nearby machine became the steady, menacing drip of water in a marsh cave. He was free, but he was a prisoner of his own memories. A kind-faced nurse with tired eyes changed his bandages. "You're one of the lucky ones," she said softly. Her words meant to comfort. Leo just stared at the canvas ceiling. Luck? Was it luck that had left Miller dead in a field? Was it luck that had forced him to slither through mud and hide in graves? He felt no luck. He felt a hollow, vast emptiness, a canyon where his former self had been. Later that day, the colonel visited again, this time with a reporter from Stars and Stripes in tow, a young man with an eager, unlined face and a notebook. "The boys back home need to hear this story, son," the colonel said, clapping a firm hand on Leo's shoulder. "A real-life tale of heroism." Leo flinched at the touch. Heroism? He wanted to tell them about the taste of stolen bread, the feel of a dead man's map case, the sound of dogs in the fog. He wanted to describe the sheer pants-wetting terror of being hunted. But the reporter's eyes were too bright, too full of the myth of war. So he gave them the clean version, the version with the edges sanded off. He spoke of duty, of determination, of outsmarting the enemy. He left out the old man's terror, the resistance's cold executions, the German soldier humming in the church, the shame of licking water from a floor. They took his picture, his hollow eyes and gaunt face looking like a caricature of a soldier. After they left, a deep shame settled over him. He had betrayed the truth of his journey, sanitized it for public consumption. The real story was too dark, too complicated, too human for a headline. That night, the dreams came. Not dreams, but visitations. Miller, his face not as it was in life, but as it was in death, pale and accusing. The old Frenchman pointing a trembling finger as German boots crunched outside. The bloated German corpse in the marsh, its eyes popping open. He woke in a cold sweat, his sheets tangled around him, a scream trapped in his throat. The nurse came running, soothing him, but her words were like water on stone. He was back there. He would always be back there. The doctor, a major with a weary demeanor, called it battle fatigue and recommended rest and reassurance. But Leo knew it was something else. It was the ghost of every step of those 100 miles taking up residence inside him. A week passed. He was being processed for a transfer back to England for proper convalescence. He was given a new uniform, the wool scratchy and unfamiliar against his skin. He was supposed to be grateful. He was a hero. But as he packed his few belongings, his hands brushed against the old, tattered map case they had returned to him as a souvenir. The feel of the oilskin sent a jolt of pure, undiluted fear through his system. His breath hitched. The sounds of the hospital faded, replaced by the buzz of mosquitoes and the sucking sound of mud. He was in the marsh again, the fog closing in. He dropped the case as if it were white hot. He couldn't take it with him. He couldn't take any of it with him. The journey was over, but the escape had just begun. And as he looked around the sterile tent, at the other wounded men lost in their own private pain, he realized with a crushing finality that there was no jeep, no ship, no plane that could ever take him far enough away from the man he had become in those 100 miles. The front line wasn't a place on a map. It was a scar on his soul, and he had carried it back with him.
The plane shuddered as its wheels left the French soil, a physical severing from the continent of his nightmares. Leo stared out the small round window, watching the patchwork of fields and the jagged scars of bomb craters diminish into abstraction. Below was history, was pain, was 100 miles of walked hell. Above was the cold, clear blue of the stratosphere, a domain untouched by war. He should have felt lightness, a lifting of the immense weight he had carried for so long. Instead, he felt untethered, a ghost disconnected from both heaven and earth. England materialized through the clouds, a vision of profound, almost shocking green. It was a picture of peace, a world that had only known the war from a distance, through the wail of air raid sirens and the newsreels. The airbase was a whirlwind of orderly efficiency. He was ushered into a line of returning soldiers, some wounded, some just rotated out. The atmosphere was different here. There was laughter, the sharp, relieved laughter of men who had cheated death, for now. Leo felt like an imposter among them. His journey set him apart, marked him in a way his clean uniform could not hide. Officers would look at his file, then at his face, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and a strange, wary respect. He was assigned a bunk in a transient barracks, a clean, well-lit building that felt like a palace after his foxholes and shell holes. That night, a group of soldiers from Texas, their uniforms still crisp, invited him to the local pub. "Come on, hero," one of them slurred, slinging a friendly arm around his shoulders. "Let's get you a proper drink." The pub was a cacophony of life, the clink of glasses, the roar of conversation, the tinny sound of a piano playing Roll Out the Barrel. It was everything he had dreamed of in the mud. But now that he was here, it felt alien and overwhelming. The press of bodies was too close, a reminder of hiding in cramped spaces. A backfiring truck outside sent him diving under the table, his heart hammering, his hands clutching at nothing. The laughter of the Texans died in their throats. They helped him up, their faces now embarrassed and confused. "Hey buddy, it's okay. It was just a backfire," one said, patting his back awkwardly. Leo mumbled an apology and fled, the cheerful music feeling like a mockery. He walked the blacked-out streets of the English town, the darkness his only comfort. It was the same darkness that had hidden him, protected him. He found himself automatically scanning the shadows for movement, his ears straining for the sound of a foreign language. The habits of a hunted animal were not so easily discarded. A few days later, he was summoned to a briefing room. A stern-looking general from Supreme Headquarters was there, along with several intelligence officers. They wanted a more detailed debriefing, a granular account of everything he had seen. The German dispositions, the morale of the troops, the condition of the roads and bridges. For hours they pored over maps, and Leo, his finger tracing the routes he had walked, brought their charts to life with terrible, intimate detail. The bridge here, it's heavily guarded, but the eastern abutment is damaged. A man could climb it. The marsh here, impenetrable to vehicles, but a determined squad on foot using the paths I took. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a living, breathing piece of intelligence. The general listened, his eyes never leaving Leo's face. When it was over, the general stood. "Connolly, what you've given us is more valuable than a whole division of spies. We're adjusting our entire push based on this." He paused. "I'm putting you in for the Distinguished Service Cross." Leo should have felt pride. He should have felt vindication. Instead, he felt a profound weariness. The medal would be another piece of the myth, another layer of varnish over the ugly, complicated truth. He was thanked and dismissed. As he walked back to his barracks, a fresh-faced private ran up to him, holding out a folded piece of paper and a pen. "Sir, could I have your autograph? I read about you in the paper. It's an honor, sir." Leo looked at the boy, who couldn't have been more than 18. He saw Miller in his eyes. He took the pen, his hand trembling slightly. What name should he sign? The hero from the papers, or the terrified man from the marsh? He scrawled something illegible and handed it back, unable to meet the boy's admiring gaze. The weight of the hero's mantle was heavier than the map case had ever been. He was a symbol now, and symbols weren't allowed to flinch at backfiring trucks or wake up screaming in the night. The war for France might have been behind him, but a new, more subtle battle was beginning here, in the heart of peace, and he was utterly unprepared for the front lines.
The ceremony was brief, sterile, and utterly surreal. Standing on a hastily erected platform in the center of the base, Leo felt the eyes of 1,000 soldiers upon him. The sun glinted off his newly polished buttons and the medal the general was pinning to his chest, the Distinguished Service Cross. The weight of the bronze was insignificant, but the symbolism was an anchor around his neck. The general spoke words about conspicuous gallantry, extraordinary heroism, and unwavering devotion to duty. Each phrase felt like a stone being placed on Miller's grave. He had not been gallant, he had been terrified. His heroism had been a desperate, scrambling thing. His devotion was to survival, not to an abstract concept of duty. As the general shook his hand and the crowd applauded, Leo's eyes swept over the sea of faces. He saw admiration, inspiration, a burning desire to emulate the legend they thought he was. He felt like a fraud standing in a cathedral of his own making. After the ceremony, he was swept into an officers' club for a reception. The room was thick with cigar smoke and the cloying scent of whiskey. Majors and colonels clapped him on the back, their hands heavy and proprietary. "Tell us about the dogs, Connolly," one boomed, his face flushed with drink. "By God, to give them the slip like that!" Leo forced a smile, a tight, painful stretching of his lips. He regurgitated the sanitized version, the one from the newspapers, and watched their eyes light up. He was a good story, a distraction from the grim bureaucracy of war planning. He was their dancing bear. He escaped as soon as he could, retreating to the one place he found any solace, the base's firing range. The solid, familiar weight of an M1 Garand in his hands was a comfort. The smell of gunpowder was more real to him than the smell of whiskey and cigars. He loaded a clip, slammed the bolt home, and began to fire at the distant targets. Crack, crack, crack. The recoil against his shoulder was a grounding force, each shot a punctuation mark in the silent scream building inside him. He wasn't shooting at paper targets, he was shooting at shadows in a French forest, at the searchlight on the river, at the sound of German voices in a church. When his ammunition was spent, he stood there in the sudden silence, the acrid smoke wreathing his head, his ears ringing. It was the only time he felt quiet inside. A voice behind him broke the spell. "They don't get it, do they, son?" Leo turned. It was an older sergeant, a grizzled man with a face like a relief map of his own wars. He was leaning against a post, cleaning his nails with a knife. The officers, the papers, they think it's about the big moments, the medals. The sergeant gestured with his knife towards the medal on Leo's chest. They don't understand the miles between the big moments, the cold, the thirst, the sound of your own heart trying to beat its way out of your chest. Leo looked at the man, and for the first time since he'd returned, he felt seen. Not as a hero, but as a soldier. He gave a slow, grateful nod. "It never really leaves you, does it?" Leo asked, his voice quiet. The sergeant shook his head, a world of sorrow in his eyes. "No, son, it don't. You just learn to carry it. Some days are heavier than others." He sheathed his knife and walked away, leaving Leo alone with the truth. That night, he was given his orders. He was not being sent back to the front. His unique experience was deemed too valuable. He was being reassigned to a training camp in Scotland to help teach reconnaissance and survival techniques to new recruits. It was a safe job, a cushy job, an honor. But as he read the orders, a cold dread filled him. He would have to stand in front of boys like Miller and the private who asked for his autograph and teach them how to stay alive. He would have to distill his 100 miles of terror into a curriculum. How could he teach them about the smell of fear? How could he explain that the most important weapon wasn't your rifle, but your will to endure the next 5 seconds, and then the next? He was to become a prophet of survival, preaching a gospel of horror to a congregation of the innocent. He packed his bag, the medal tucked at the very bottom, wrapped in a sock. He was heading to a new battlefield, one where the enemy was memory, and the objective was to impart enough wisdom to keep other boys from having to make the same terrible solitary walk he had. The plane to Scotland awaited, and as he walked towards it, he felt the weight of every one of those 100 miles settling onto his shoulders for good. The Scottish Highlands were a stark, majestic landscape of brooding mountains and deep, misty glens, a world away from the claustrophobic hedgerows of France and the sterile order of the English base. But for Leo, the mist was the same mist that had clung to the Marais, and the silence of the mountains was the same predatory silence that had preceded the baying of hounds. The training camp was a sprawling makeshift city of tents and Nissen huts, buzzing with the raw, untested energy of thousands of new recruits, boys from Kansas and California who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Leo's role was simple in description, impossible in execution: to shatter their innocence, carefully and deliberately to save their lives. His first lecture was in a large, drafty tent. He stood before 100 fresh faces, all bright eyes and eager anticipation. They had heard of him, the lone walker, the hero. He looked out at them, these boys who still smelled of home, and his throat went dry. He began not with tactics, but with a question. How many of you think you're ready to kill a German? Every hand shot up, confident, zealous. He nodded slowly. Now, how many of you are ready to lie in your own filth for 3 days, not moving, not making a sound, while dysentery cramps your guts and insects eat you alive, just to avoid one? The hands wavered. The confidence flickered. This was his duty now, not to create heroes, but to create survivors. He took them out on the moors, teaching them how to move without a sound, how to read the land not as a picture, but as a text of threats and opportunities. He taught them how to purify water, how to set snares, how to navigate by the stars. But he also taught them the harder lessons. He taught them the psychology of fear. The moment you think you're safe, he'd tell them, his voice low and intense, is the moment you die. Paranoia isn't a sickness out here, it's a vaccine. He saw himself in their eyes, the skepticism, the slow dawning horror as they realized this wasn't the adventure they'd signed up for. One night, during a night navigation exercise, a thunderstorm rolled in over the mountains. The wind howled, the rain fell in blinding sheets, and the lightning strikes were sudden, terrifying detonations that illuminated the landscape in stark, frozen tableaus. The recruits were scattered, disoriented, some beginning to panic. Leo, standing on a high ridge, felt a familiar, almost welcome calm settle over him. This was his element, chaos. He moved through the storm, gathering his terrified students, his voice a steady, commanding presence in the maelstrom. He found shelter for them in a lee of a rock face, and as they huddled together, shivering, he saw them look at him not with the starry-eyed admiration of before, but with a new, deeper respect. They saw the man who had walked 100 miles, not the myth. He was no longer just an instructor. He was a living testament to endurance. After the storm passed, as a pale dawn broke, one of the boys, a lanky kid from Oregon, approached him. "Sir," he said, his voice still shaky, "back there, in the storm, were you scared?" Leo looked at the boy, at the honest need for truth in his eyes. He thought of the metal wrapped in a sock at the bottom of his footlocker. He thought of Miller. He thought of the taste of muddy water and the sound of a German soldier humming a folk song. "Terrified," Leo said, the word feeling like a confession and a liberation. Every single second. The trick isn't to not be afraid. The trick is to do it anyway. The trick is to keep walking. The boy nodded, a profound understanding passing between them. It was the first real lesson Leo had taught. In that moment, under the clearing Scottish sky, Leo Connolly felt a shift within himself. The ghost of his journey would always be with him, a permanent tenant in the rooms of his mind. But here, in this training camp, he found a purpose for the pain. He could not change his own past, but he could arm these boys for their future. He could give them the tools he had lacked, the wisdom bought with 100 miles of suffering. The war was not over for him. It had simply changed fronts. He was no longer a messenger running from the enemy. He was a sentinel, standing guard over the next generation, ensuring that the price he had paid was not just for a single piece of intelligence, but for the lives of the men who would follow. The walk was over. The mission continued.